You can't ride without paying. Rules are rules, the driver said flatly, his voice cutting through the low hum of the bus like a blade as rain hammered against the windows and the smell of wet coats filled the cramped space. And for a second no one moved. Not the man standing in the aisle with soaked sleeves clinging to his arms. Not the passengers pretending to scroll on their phones. Not even Maya Carter, who sat 2 rows back, clutching the last $10 she had to her name like it was oxygen, because in a way, it was lunch, it was a ride to her interview. It was one more chance to stay afloat in a city that didn't wait for anyone. And yet the silence stretched, heavy, uncomfortable, until someone near the back muttered under their breath, "Figures," and another voice, sharper, colder, added, "People always have a story." And the man didn't argue, didn't defend himself, he just stood there, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes lowered, as if he had already accepted whatever came next, and something about that. Maybe the quiet, maybe the dignity, maybe the way no one else moved, made Maya's grip tighten around that wrinkled bill as her mind raced through everything she would lose if she let it go. The interview at 9:30, the rent she was already late on, the empty fridge waiting back in her tiny studio with flickering lights. But then the driver sighed loudly, already reaching to open the door, ready to send the man back into the rain like it was nothing. Like he was nothing. And before Maya could think herself out of it, she stood up, her voice smaller than she expected but steady enough to carry. "I'll cover it." And just like that, every head turned, every glance sharpened, every unspoken judgment landed squarely on her. A young black woman in a worn jacket, offering money she clearly couldn't spare, and the woman across the aisle raised an eyebrow, lips curling slightly as she whispered, not quietly enough, "You people always fall for that." And Maya felt it, that sting, that familiar weight of being seen and dismissed all at once. But she didn't respond, didn't look away either. She just walked forward, placed the $10 bill into the driver's hand, and nodded once, like it was the simplest thing in the world, like kindness. Didn't cost everything. And the man finally looked up, surprised, something unreadable flickering in his eyes as he took the transfer slip the driver shoved toward him, their fingers brushing for just a second, long enough for a quiet, almost disbelieving "thank you" to slip out. And Maya gave a small shrug, already turning back, already bracing herself for what came next, because now she had nothing left, no backup plan, no safety net, just the sound of rain and the weight of a decision she couldn't undo. And as the bus lurched forward again, conversations resumed in low murmurs, glances lingered a little too long, and Maya returned to her seat, staring out the window as water streaked down the glass, blurring the city into something distant and unreachable. And she told herself it didn't matter, that she'd figure something out like she always did, that missing one opportunity wouldn't define her. But deep down she knew it might, because this city didn't hand out second chances. Not to people like her, not without a cost. And 30 minutes later, when the bus stopped 3 blocks too far for her to make it on time, Maya stepped off into the cold rain with nothing but her phone at 2% in a path that stretched longer than she had the strength for. And she walked anyway, sneakers soaking through within minutes, breath visible in the chilly morning air, each step heavier than the last as the clock ticked down toward a future slipping quietly out of reach. And behind her, inside that same bus, the man sat near the back now, dry enough, silent, turning that small paper ticket over in his hands like it meant more than it should, like it held something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something real, something uncalculated. And as the city blurred past the window, he didn't look at his phone, didn't check the time, didn't move at all, just stared at the ticket and then out into the rain, as if trying to memorize the moment, the girl, the choice she made, when no one else did. And hours later, far above the noise and gray of the streets, in a glass office overlooking Manhattan where the skyline stretched wide and untouched by the chaos below, that same man stood by the window, now dry, now composed, now something entirely different, holding that same bus ticket between his fingers as a faint smile crossed his face, subtle but certain, before he turned to the assistant waiting nearby and said in a calm, measured tone, "Find her." By the time Maya reached the glass doors of the office building, her hair was damp from the rain and her shoes made that quiet, unmistakable squish with every step, the kind that turned heads in a lobby that smelled like polished marble and expensive coffee. And she knew before she even checked her phone that she was late. Not just a few minutes late, but the kind of late that closes doors before you even get a chance to explain. And still she stepped inside, shoulders squared, holding on to the last thread of hope she had left. Because walking away without trying would feel worse than rejection. And the receptionist barely looked up when Maya approached, her voice polite but distant as she said the words Maya already expected. "I am sorry." The hiring manager had to step into another meeting. And just like that, the air seemed to leave the room, like the building itself had decided she did not belong there. And Maya nodded slowly, forcing a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes, whispering a quiet, "Thank you," before turning away, because there was nothing else to say. No argument that could fix being too late. No explanation that could change how people saw her the moment she walked in soaked and empty-handed. And outside the rain had not let up, falling in steady sheets that blurred the city into gray streaks. And for a moment Maya just stood there under the awning, watching people pass by with umbrellas and purpose, each of them moving towards something, while she stood still with nowhere to go. And that was when the weight of her decision finally settled in, not as regret, but as consequence, because kindness did not pay rent, kindness did not buy food. Kindness did not stop the world from moving on without you. And yet, even as that thought crossed her mind, she could still see the look in the man's eyes on the bus, that quiet surprise, that gratitude that did not feel rehearsed or manipulative. And somehow that memory kept her from breaking completely, kept her from letting the bitterness take hold, even as her stomach tightened with hunger and her phone finally died in her hand, leaving her disconnected from everything except the cold reality around her. And the walk back to her apartment felt longer than usual, each block stretching out like a test of how much she could endure before giving up. And when she finally reached the narrow building with peeling paint and flickering hallway lights, she already knew what was waiting for her before she even saw the note taped to her door. The landlord's handwriting sharp and impatient, reminding her that rent had been due 3 days ago, that this was the final notice, that by tomorrow the room would be given to someone else who could pay on time. And Maya stood there for a long moment, staring at the paper as if it might change if she looked long enough. But it did not. It never did. And slowly she peeled it off, folded it once, and slipped it into her pocket like it was just another bill, just another thing to deal with later. Even though she had no idea how she would. And inside the apartment nothing had changed, the same small bed, the same cracked window that let in a draft, the same silence that pressed in on her from all sides. But it felt different now, emptier somehow, like the space already knew she would not be there much longer. And Maya sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting in her lap, trying to think, trying to plan. But every option seemed to lead back to the same place, nowhere. And for a brief second she allowed herself to wonder if that $10 could have made the difference, if holding on to it might have kept this day from unraveling the way it had. But the thought passed quickly, replaced by something steadier, something quieter, because deep down she knew that even if she could go back, she would still make the same choice. She would still stand up, still pay the fare, still refuse to become the kind of person who looks away when someone needs help, even if the world punished her for it. And as night began to settle over the city, the lights outside flickering on one by one, Maya lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling as hunger and exhaustion pulled at her. And somewhere across the city, far removed from the narrow streets and dim hallways she called home, a different kind of silence filled a high-rise office where Ethan Blake sat at a sleek desk, the rain now just a distant pattern against thick glass windows, the city lights reflecting in sharp lines across polished surfaces, and in his hand, still, was that small bus ticket, creased and slightly damp from earlier. And he turned it over slowly, again and again, as if trying to understand. Something that numbers and reports never could, because in his world, everything had a value, everything could be measured, predicted, controlled. But what Maya had done did not fit into any of those categories. It was irrational, inconvenient, costly, and yet it felt more real than anything he had seen in a long time. And when his assistant stepped into the room, tablet in hand, ready to discuss schedules and meetings and projections, Ethan did not look up right away, his gaze still fixed on that small piece of paper. And when he finally spoke, His voice was calm but carried a quiet certainty that left no room for question. "I want everything you can find on the bus route from this morning. Cameras, payment logs, anything." And the assistant hesitated for just a fraction of a second, surprised by the request but smart enough not to ask why. Simply nodding as she replied, "Yes, sir," before turning to leave. And as the door closed behind her, Ethan leaned back slightly, eyes drifting once more to the rain beyond the glass. The memory of that moment replaying in his mind with unexpected clarity. The way the bus had gone silent. The way she had stepped forward without hesitation. The way she had not asked for anything in return. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something shift, something small but undeniable, like a crack forming in a surface that had always seemed unbreakable. And he tightened his grip on the ticket just slightly, as if anchoring himself to that moment, to that choice, to the girl who had nothing and still chose to give, and quietly, almost to himself, he said, "Let us see who you really are." The next morning arrived without ceremony, just a pale gray light slipping through the cracked window as the city woke up without her. And for a moment Maya lay still, staring at the ceiling as if time itself had paused, as if maybe, just maybe, yesterday had been a bad dream that would dissolve the second she moved. But the stiffness in her body and the quiet growl in her stomach reminded her that it was real, all of it. The missed interview, the empty wallet, the notice folded neatly in her jacket pocket, and she sat up slowly, pulling on the same worn shoes that had not yet dried, their dampness a small but constant reminder of how quickly things could unravel. And outside the air was colder, sharper, the kind that made every breath feel heavier. And Maya stepped into it without hesitation because staying inside would not change anything. Because waiting had never been an option for someone like her. And the streets were already alive with movement. People heading to offices, cafes opening their doors, delivery trucks lining the curbs. A rhythm she used to feel part of, but now watched from the outside. And she walked with no clear destination at first, just following the flow until it carried her toward a small community center she had passed 100 times, but never entered. A place with a faded sign that read, "Open Hands Kitchen." And something about the warmth spilling through the windows, the quiet hum of voices inside, pulled her closer before she could second-guess herself. And when she stepped in, the smell of soup and fresh bread wrapped around her like something almost forgotten, something human. And for the first time in hours, she felt the tension in her shoulders ease just slightly. And a woman behind the counter looked up, her expression not suspicious, not dismissive, just calm, and said, "You can grab a tray, sweetheart." Like it was the most normal thing in the world, like Maya belonged there. And that simple acceptance hit harder than anything else had that day, because it was so rare, so unexpected. And Maya nodded quietly, taking a tray, moving, like something she had not earned but had been given anyway. And as she took the first bite, slow and deliberate, she closed her eyes for just a second, letting that moment exist without fear of what came next, without calculating how long it would last. And across the room, conversations flowed softly, people sharing stories, laughter breaking through in small bursts. And for a brief moment, Maya was not behind, not judged, not trying to prove anything. She was just there, existing, and it was enough, at least for now. And miles away, in a quiet conference room high above the city, screens lit up one by one as data began to fill the space. Bus routes mapped out in precise lines, timestamps aligning with surveillance footage, digital records tracing a path that most people would never think to follow. And Ethan Blake stood at the center of it all, hands in his pockets, watching as fragments of a moment turned into something tangible, something trackable. And his assistant spoke, clearly, efficiently, pointing out details as they appeared. Route 27, 8:12 a.m. departure. This is the bus. And the screen shifted to grainy footage, passengers boarding, heads down, routine, until the moment came into view, the man standing, the driver shaking his head, the pause, the silence, and then her, stepping forward, small but certain, placing the bill into the driver's hand without hesitation. And even through the muted footage, even without sound, the impact of it was unmistakable. The way the space changed, the way attention shifted, the way she did not seek recognition, did not look around to see who was watching. She just acted, and Ethan leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing not with doubt, but with focus. As if this was the part that mattered most, not the transaction, not the money, but the intent behind it. And the footage continued, showing her returning to her seat, the bus moving on, the moment ending for everyone else, but not for him. And the assistant tapped. Another command, pulling up a still image, zooming in just enough to capture her face, damp hair, tired eyes, something steady beneath it all. And she said, "We can run facial recognition, cross-reference with public records. It will not take long." But Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on that image, studying it not like data, but like a question, like something that could not be answered with algorithms alone. And finally he nodded once, quiet but decisive. "Do it." And as the system began its work, lines of code replacing the blurred uncertainty with something more concrete, something identifiable, Ethan stepped back slightly, that same bus ticket still in his hand, now resting against his palm like a reminder, like proof that not everything valuable comes with a price tag. And back at the community center, Maya finished her meal slowly, not rushing, not wasting a single bite. And when she stood to return her tray, the woman behind the counter gave her a small nod and said, "We are always looking for extra hands if you need a place to be." And Maya hesitated for just a second, that offer hanging in the air like a possibility she had not considered, not because it solved everything, but because it gave her something she had been losing piece by piece, a sense of purpose, of being needed. And she nodded quietly. "I can help," not knowing that at that exact moment, across the city, her name had just appeared on a screen, her identity no longer a mystery, her life no longer invisible, and the choice she made with $10 was about to reach far beyond anything she could imagine. Kindness does not change your life in a day. It tests how much you are willing to lose first. Maya thought quietly as she tied the borrowed apron around her waist, the fabric slightly too big, the knot uneven but secure enough to hold. And for the first time since everything had started falling apart, her hands had something to do, something steady, something real. And the woman who had welcomed her earlier, Miss Evelyn, handed her a stack of clean trays with a gentle smile that carried both warmth and experience, the kind that had seen people at their lowest and still chose to believe in them. "Start with these, honey. Just keep them moving," she said, and Maya nodded, stepping into the rhythm of the kitchen where time was measured not by clocks but by need, by the steady line of people who came through the doors looking for something simple, a meal, a moment of dignity, a place where they were not invisible. And Maya moved quietly at first, observing, learning, adjusting to the pace as she wiped tables, refilled cups, carried trays back and forth, her movements careful but purposeful. And something inside her began to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to remind her that she still had value, even here, especially here, because no one asked what she had lost, no one questioned why she was there. They just accepted what she offered, and that acceptance felt heavier than any judgment she had faced, because it required her to show up, to contribute, to keep going even when she had nothing left to give. And hours passed without her noticing, the noise of the outside world fading into the background as the kitchen filled with quiet conversations and the soft clatter of dishes. And every now and then someone would thank her, a simple, "I appreciate you," or "God bless you," words that cost nothing but carried more weight than anything she had heard in days. And she would nod, offering a small smile, not out of habit, but because she meant it. Because for the first time in a long while, she was part of something that made sense, something that did not measure her worth by what she owned or how much she earned. And across the city, in a building where silence was controlled and every movement had purpose, Ethan Blake stood in front of a screen that now displayed more than just an image. It showed a name, an address, a record of jobs applied for, a pattern of someone trying to stay afloat in a system that rarely made room for people. A statement meant for anyone else. It was a recognition of something that could not be quantified, something that had disrupted the order of his world in a way he could not ignore. And his assistant paused briefly before responding. "Would you like me to arrange a meeting?" But Ethan shook his head slightly, his gaze still fixed on the screen. "Not yet," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "I want to see what she does next when no one is watching." And the room fell silent again, not out of uncertainty, but because the direction had been set. And back at the community center, Maya wiped down another table, her movements more confident now, her shoulders no longer weighed down by the same heaviness that had followed her earlier. And when the lunch rush began to slow, Miss Evelyn approached her again, holding out a small paper cup filled with hot coffee, the steam rising in soft curls. "You have been on your feet for hours. Take a minute," she said, and Maya hesitated before accepting it, her fingers wrapping around the warmth as if it was something fragile, something she had to be careful not to lose, and she took a small sip, letting the heat settle into her chest, grounding her in a way she had not expected, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe, to exist without calculating the next step, without worrying about where she would sleep tomorrow or how she would fix everything that had gone wrong. And Miss Evelyn studied her quietly before asking, "You looking for work, or just trying to get through today?" And Maya gave a small, honest smile. "Both," she replied, and the answer hung between them, simple but heavy with truth, and Miss Evelyn nodded slowly, as if she understood more than Maya had said. "Then you start with today, the rest will come," she said, her voice steady, not offering false hope, but something more grounded, something that felt real, and Maya nodded in return, holding onto those words like she had held onto that $10 bill, knowing they might not solve everything but willing to believe they meant something. And as the afternoon light shifted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor, Maya returned to work, unaware that across the city, someone was watching her story unfold not as a distant observer but as someone already stepping into its path, someone who had decided that this moment, this choice, this girl, was not something he was willing to forget. Sometimes the world does not test your kindness once. It watches to see if you will do it again. Maya did not say it out loud, but she felt it in the quiet rhythm of her hands as she refilled another cup, wiped another table, moved through the small kitchen like she had always belonged there. Even though just yesterday, she had been standing in the rain wondering where her life had gone. And now, somehow, she was here, not fixed, not saved, but still moving forward, and that mattered more than drawer and pulling out a folded envelope, placing it gently on the counter between them. "It is not much, but it is honest," she said, and Maya hesitated, looking down at the envelope like it carried more weight than its contents. Because to her, it did. It was not just money. It was proof that she could still earn something, still stand on her own, even if it was only a small step. And slowly, she picked it up, her fingers tightening slightly as she whispered, "Thank you." And Miss Evelyn nodded once. "You earned it," she replied simply, and those words lingered longer than anything else, because they were not given lightly. They were not empty. They were real. And across the city, Ethan Blake stood once again in front of the wide glass window of his office, the skyline stretching out before him as the sun dipped lower, painting the buildings in shades of amber and shadow, and in his hand, the bus ticket remained, now smoothed out, its creases carefully pressed, as if preserving. It mattered, and behind him, the quiet hum of technology continued, screens still displaying fragments of Maya's life, but he was no longer looking at them, because what he needed to understand was not in the data, it was in the pattern of her choices, the consistency of who she was when no one was offering her anything in return. And his assistant approached again, tablet in hand, her tone respectful but curious. "We have confirmed her location. She has been at the community kitchen since this morning." And Ethan nodded slowly, not surprised, because in a way, it made sense. Someone who gave her last $10 would not stop there. That kind of character did not appear once and disappear. It repeated itself, quietly, consistently, without needing recognition. And he asked, "Has she taken anything from them?" And the assistant shook her head. "No. She has been helping, volunteering. She was offered food and stayed to work." And something in that answer seemed to settle into place. For him, like the final piece of a puzzle he had not realized he was solving. And he turned slightly, his gaze no longer distant but focused, deliberate. "Prepare the car," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that signaled this was no longer observation. This was action, and the assistant nodded. Without hesitation, already moving to carry out the instruction, and back at the community center, Maya stepped outside for a moment, the air cooler now, the city quieter in that brief space between rush and night, and she opened the envelope carefully, her fingers steady as she counted the small amount inside. Not much by most standards, but to her, It was something solid, something earned, something she could hold on to. And she allowed herself a small breath of relief, knowing it might buy. The door opened slowly. She did not step back, did not tense. She simply watched as the man from the bus stepped out, no longer soaked, no longer overlooked, but composed, confident, carrying a presence that did not need to announce itself. And for a second, the world seemed to pause again, just like it had that morning. But this time the silence felt different, heavier, more intentional. And Maya's eyes narrowed slightly as recognition settled in, not with surprise, but with curiosity, because she had not expected to see him again. Not here, not like this. And he took a few steps toward her, measured, calm, stopping just far enough to give space but close enough to be heard. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because some moments do not need words immediately. They need acknowledgement. They need time to unfold. And finally he said, "You should not have done that." His voice steady, not accusing, not grateful, just honest. And Maya tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable as she replied, "Then you should have brought money." And the answer landed between them with a quiet firmness, not defensive, not apologetic, just real. And something in Ethan's expression shifted, not irritation, not amusement, but something closer to respect, because she had not softened her response, had not adjusted herself to make him comfortable. She had simply told the truth, and he nodded once, acknowledging it, before reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out the small bus ticket, now flattened, preserved, and he held it up slightly, not as a gesture of importance, but as a reminder. "This changed my day," he said, and Maya looked at it briefly before meeting his gaze again. "It cost me mine," she replied, and there was no bitterness in her voice, just clarity. Just the simple fact of what had happened. And Ethan exhaled slowly, not surprised, because he already knew. He had seen the data, the missed interview, the eviction notice, the pattern of loss that followed that single act of kindness. But hearing her say it, hearing it in her voice, grounded it in a way numbers never could. And he said, "I want to fix that." And that was the moment everything shifted, because Maya's posture changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough to signal that something had crossed a line, her shoulders straightening, her gaze sharpening. As she took a small step back, creating distance not just physically but emotionally, and she shook her head once. Firm, immediate. "No," she said, and the word hung in the air longer than expected, because it was not hesitation, it was decision. And Ethan paused, studying her, trying to understand not the refusal itself but the reason behind it, because in his world, problems had solutions, losses had compensation, and yet here she was, rejecting the very thing most people would reach for. Without question, and he asked quietly, "Why?" And Maya let out a small breath, not frustrated, not overwhelmed, just steady. "Because I did not do it for you," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "And I am not going to let you turn it into something it was not." And there it was, the line she would not cross, the boundary she would not let him redefine. And for a moment, Ethan said nothing, because that answer did not fit into any of the outcomes he had anticipated. It was not gratitude, not resentment, not negotiation. It was something else entirely, something that required him to adjust, to reconsider, to step outside of the structure he was used to. And slowly, he nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because whether he understood it fully or not, he recognized its weight. And he lowered the ticket slightly, his grip loosening just enough to show that he was listening. "Then let me ask you something else," he said, his tone shifting, less certain now, more open. "What do you need?" And Maya hesitated for the first time, not because she did not have an answer, but because the question itself felt different. It was not offering, not imposing, it was asking. And she looked away briefly, her eyes scanning the street, the people passing by, the world continuing as if this moment did not exist. And when she looked back at him, her expression had softened just slightly, not with vulnerability, but with honesty. "I need a chance," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any request for money or rescue, because a chance was not something that could be handed over easily. It required trust, it required belief, it required a willingness to see someone beyond their current circumstances. And Ethan held her gaze, the words settling in, reshaping the direction of everything he had planned. and after a moment, he gave a small nod, more to himself than to her, as if accepting a challenge he had not expected. Then let us start there, he said quietly, and for the first time since stepping out of that car, his voice carried something new, not authority, not control, but intention, and Maya watched him carefully, not convinced, not trusting, but not walking away either, because something in his tone had shifted, something that suggested this was no longer about fixing a mistake. It was about understanding a person, and as the city lights flickered on around them, casting long reflections across the pavement, the distance between them remained, not closed, not resolved, but no longer unbridgeable, because for the first time, they were not standing on opposite sides of a moment. They were standing at the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. A chance is not something you are given. It is something someone risks on you. The words lingered in the space between them even after neither of them said anything for a few seconds, the city continuing around them as if this moment did not matter, cars passing, footsteps echoing, distant voices blending into the background. But for Maya, everything felt sharper, more defined, because she knew what it meant to ask for a chance, and how rarely the answer was yes. And Ethan studied her carefully, not like a problem to solve, but like a decision to make. And for the first time in a long time, he did not rely on numbers or projections. He relied on instinct, something he had learned to ignore over the years. And he said, "Then come with me tomorrow," his tone calm but direct. No promises, no contracts, just a day. And Maya's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in evaluation, because she had learned that words often came with conditions, hidden expectations that revealed themselves too late, and she asked, "A day doing what?" And Ethan allowed a small pause before answering. "Seeing how you think, how you work, how you decide." And the answer was vague, intentionally so, but not misleading. And Maya crossed her arms loosely, shifting her weight slightly as she considered it. The offer simple on the surface, but carrying layers she could not fully see yet. And she glanced back toward the community center behind her, the warm lights still glowing through the windows, a place that had asked nothing from her except to show up. And then she looked back at him, at the man who represented something entirely different, something uncertain, something that could change everything or nothing at all. And she said, "I am not going to pretend to be someone else," her voice steady, setting the boundary before the decision. And Ethan nodded immediately. "Good," he replied. "I would not know what to do with that anyway." And for a brief second, the corner of Maya's mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to show that something in his response had landed correctly, and she took a small breath, weighing the risk, because that was what this was, not an opportunity, not yet, but a risk, and she had already taken one the day before, and she knew exactly how much it had cost her, and yet here she was again, standing at another edge, another decision point, and slowly, she nodded once. "One day," she said, and Ethan gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return, as if acknowledging the agreement not as a favor, but as a mutual understanding, and he reached into his pocket, not pulling out money, not offering anything immediate, but instead handing her a simple card with an address and a time. 9 in the morning, he said. "Do not be late." And there was no sharpness in his voice, no judgment, just a quiet reminder that time mattered in his world. And Maya took the card, her fingers brushing against it as if testing its reality, and she glanced down briefly before slipping it into her pocket next to the envelope she had earned, two very different symbols of what her day had become, and she looked back up, meeting his gaze one more time. "I will be there," she said, not as a promise to him, but as a commitment to herself, and Ethan stepped back slightly, giving her space again, the conversation reaching its natural end without needing anything more. And as he turned toward the car, he paused just for a moment, glancing back at her, not to say anything else, but to take in the image one more time, the girl standing under the city lights, steady despite everything. And then he got into the car, the door closing softly as it pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the flow of traffic as if it had never been there at all. And Maya stood where she was for a few seconds longer, the weight of what had just happened settling in slowly, not overwhelming, not dramatic, but significant in a way she could not ignore. And she reached into her pocket, pulling out the card again, reading the address carefully. A place she had never been, a place that belonged to a world she had only ever seen from a distance, and she folded it once more carefully this time, before slipping it back into her pocket. And as she turned back toward the community center, the warmth inside greeted her again, familiar now, grounding, and Miss Evelyn looked up as she walked in, her expression curious but calm. "Everything all right out there?" she asked, and Maya hesitated for just a second before answering. "I think something just changed." And Miss Evelyn studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slowly, as if she understood without needing details. "Then make sure it changes you in the right direction," she said, and Maya took that in, not as advice, but as something she would carry with her into whatever came next. And later that night, as she lay back on the same thin mattress, the city noise drifting through the cracked window, she held on to the thought of tomorrow, not as a solution, not as a guarantee, but as something she had not had in a while, a possibility. And across the city, in a space defined by control and certainty, Ethan stood alone in his office once more, the bus ticket now placed carefully on his desk, no longer in his hand but not out of reach either. And he looked at it for a moment before turning away, his mind already shifting to what tomorrow would reveal, not about her status or her struggle, but about her choices, because that was what mattered. That was what he was willing to bet on. And as the lights in the city dimmed one by one, both of them moved toward the same moment from completely different worlds, unaware of how much that single day was about to test everything they believed about value, opportunity, and what it really meant to deserve a chance. The difference between a test and an opportunity is whether you are allowed to fail. Maya repeated that thought in her head as she stepped off the bus the next morning, this time with exact change in her pocket, arriving 10 minutes early, not because she trusted the outcome, but because she refused to let timing be the reason she lost another chance. And the building in front of her did not look like anything she had ever walked into before. Tall glass stretching into the sky, clean lines, quiet security, the kind of place where everything felt intentional and nothing was accidental. And for a moment she stood still at the entrance, not intimidated, not overwhelmed, just aware that she was stepping into a space that was not designed with her in mind. And then she moved forward anyway, pushing through the revolving doors as if she belonged there. Because if this was a test, she was not going to fail before it even started. And inside, the air felt different, controlled, measured. People moving with purpose, conversations low and precise. And Maya approached the front desk, her voice calm as she gave Ethan's name. And within seconds, the tone shifted, not dramatically, but enough for her to notice a subtle change in posture, in attention, in how quickly someone came to escort her upstairs. And she followed without comment, observing everything, the layout, the energy, the way people looked at her, some curious, some dismissive, some already making assumptions, and she did not shrink under it. She simply took it in, storing it, understanding it, because this was part of the world she was being asked to step into. And when the elevator doors opened, Ethan was already there, standing near a wide window, dressed simply but unmistakably in control of the space. And he turned as she approached, glancing briefly at his watch before meeting her eyes. "You are early," he said, and Maya shrugged slightly. "I learned something yesterday," she replied, and that was enough. No more explanation needed, and he nodded once, acknowledging the answer, before gesturing toward the room behind him. "Come on." And as she stepped inside, she realized this was not an office in the traditional sense. It was a meeting space, screens lining the walls, tables arranged for discussion, and a small group of people already seated, their attention shifting toward her the moment she entered. And the air changed instantly, not hostile, not welcoming, just evaluative, and Ethan spoke calmly. "This is Maya," he said, no title, no explanation, just her name. And that simplicity carried weight, because it forced everyone else to figure out what that meant. And one of the men at the table leaned back slightly, his expression polite, but skeptical as he asked, "And she is here because," and Ethan did not hesitate, "because she makes decisions differently than we do." And that answer created a ripple, subtle but real, and Maya felt it. The shift from curiosity to judgment, because now she was not just an outsider. She was a variable, something unproven, something that did not belong in a room built on control and predictability. And Ethan turned to her, his tone steady. "We are reviewing a proposal," he said. "I want your input." And Maya glanced at the screen, taking in the information quickly: numbers, projections, a plan to reduce costs by cutting funding to smaller community programs in favor of larger, more visible initiatives. And she understood it immediately, not just the logic but the impact. And she asked, "What happens to the people who rely on those programs?" And one of the executives answered smoothly, "They will be redirected to more efficient services." And Maya nodded slowly, not convinced. "That means they lose access," she said. And the room went quiet for a second, not because her statement was incorrect, but because it was not framed the way they were used to hearing. It was direct, human, not filtered through strategy. And Ethan watched her closely, not intervening, not guiding, just observing how she would navigate this. And another voice spoke up, slightly sharper this time. "We are talking about scale and sustainability." And Maya met his gaze without hesitation. "And I am talking about people," she replied. And there it was again, that same clarity, that same refusal to adjust her perspective, to fit the room. And the tension rose slightly, not explosive, but enough to be felt, because she was challenging not just the proposal, but the way they approached decisions altogether. And Ethan stepped in then, not to defend her, but to redirect. "So what would you do?" he asked. And Maya took a small breath, her eyes moving across the screen again, not looking for the right answer, but for the honest one. "I would ask why those smaller programs exist in the first place," she said. "And what happens when you remove the only support some people have?" And she paused briefly before adding, "Because efficiency does not matter if it leaves people behind." And the room fell silent again, longer this time, because her answer did not fit into their framework. It did not offer a clean solution. It introduced complexity, and that was uncomfortable. And Ethan leaned back slightly, watching the reaction, the resistance, the hesitation, and he could see it clearly now. The difference he had sensed from the beginning, the thing that had made her step forward on that bus when no one else did. It was not impulse, it was perspective. And as the discussion continued, voices rising and falling, arguments forming and dissolving, Maya did not retreat, did not soften. She stayed exactly where she was, grounded, consistent. And when the meeting finally ended, the room still carrying traces of tension, Ethan turned to her, his expression unreadable but his tone certain. "That was the day," he said. And Maya looked at him, waiting, not for approval, not for validation, but for the truth. And after a brief pause, he added, "And you did not change once." And for the first time since she had walked into the building, Maya allowed herself a small, genuine smile, not because she had impressed him, but because she had not lost herself in the process. And as they stood there, the space between them felt different now, not equal, not yet, but no longer divided by misunderstanding, because the test had not been about whether she could fit into his world, it had been about whether she would refuse to. People do not like being shown what they chose to ignore. The tension from the meeting did not disappear when the room emptied. It lingered in the air, in the quiet glances exchanged between executives as they walked past Maya, without acknowledging her, in the subtle shift of tone as conversations resumed just outside the glass walls. And Maya felt it immediately, not as something new, but as something familiar, the quiet resistance that follows when truth makes people uncomfortable. And she stood there for a moment after the others had left, her posture relaxed but her mind alert, replaying the conversation. Not to question herself but to understand the reactions, because this was not about being right. It was about what her words had disrupted. And Ethan watched her from across the room, his expression thoughtful, not surprised by what had happened but interested in what would come next. And he said, "You just made half that room question their own decisions." And Maya let out a small breath, not proud, not concerned, just aware. "Good," she replied simply, and that answer held no arrogance, just intention. And Ethan nodded slightly, acknowledging it. But before he could respond further, the door opened again, and one of the executives stepped back in, his tone polite, but edged with something sharper. "Ethan, do you have a minute?" And his eyes flicked briefly toward Maya, not directly, but enough to signal that she was part of the issue. And Ethan gestured calmly, "Say it here." And the man hesitated for just a second before continuing. "We need to be careful about bringing in perspectives that are not aligned with the company's direction." And the pause before the last words was deliberate, controlled, but unmistakable, and Maya felt it clearly, not just the words but what sat behind them. The assumption that she was out of place, that her voice was disruptive not because it lacked value, but because it did not conform, and she did not react immediately, did not interrupt. She simply listened, allowing the moment to unfold fully, and Ethan's gaze remained steady, his tone calm but firm as he replied, "Our direction is exactly why she is here." And the statement landed without raising his voice, without escalation, but with a clarity that left little room for argument, and the man nodded slowly, not agreeing but recognizing the boundary. "As long as we are clear on that," he said, before turning and leaving the room again, the door closing softly behind him. And the silence that followed felt heavier than before, not uncomfortable, but charged with something new, something that had shifted beneath the surface. And Maya looked at Ethan, her expression unchanged but her voice direct. "That is going to be a problem," she said, and Ethan gave a small, almost knowing nod. "It already is," he replied, and there was no attempt to soften it, no reassurance that things would be easy, just the truth, and Maya considered that. For a moment, not discouraged, not surprised, because she had never expected this to be simple, and she said, "Then I need to know something," her tone steady. "Are you testing me or using me?" And the question was not accusatory, but it was precise, cutting through everything else to the core of what mattered. And Ethan paused, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood the weight of the question, and he stepped closer, not invading her space but closing the distance. "Enough to be clear, neither," he said. "I am learning from you." And that answer did not come with hesitation, did not carry any attempt to impress or manipulate. It was direct, grounded, and Maya studied him for a second longer, searching for any sign of insincerity, any hint that this was another version of control disguised as opportunity. But she did not find it, not in his tone, not in his posture. And she nodded once, slowly, accepting the answer not as certainty, but as something she was willing to test over time. And Ethan glanced briefly toward the door, then back at her. "Walk with me," he said, and they moved out of the room together, stepping into the open floor where conversations paused just slightly as they passed, not obvious, not confrontational, but noticeable enough to confirm what Maya had already sensed. She was being watched, evaluated, placed into categories that had nothing to do with her actual choices. And as they reached the elevator, Ethan pressed the button without speaking, giving the moment space. And when the doors closed and the noise of the office faded, Maya leaned back slightly against the wall, her gaze forward. "That was not new," she said quietly, and Ethan looked at her, not needing clarification, because he understood exactly what she meant, and he asked, "And you stayed anyway?" And Maya gave a small nod. "I always do," she replied, and there was no pride in it, no resignation, just fact. And the elevator doors opened again, revealing the lobby below, and as they stepped out, the world felt different than it had that morning, not because the building had changed, but because she had seen what was inside it and outside. The city moved the same as always, unaware of the shifts happening within a single day, and as they reached the entrance, Ethan stopped briefly, turning to face her fully. "This is where most people decide it is not worth it," he said, not as a warning, but as an observation, and Maya met his gaze without hesitation. "Then most people are not me," she replied, and the certainty in her voice left no space for doubt, and Ethan allowed the smallest hint of a smile, not because he found it surprising, but because it confirmed what he had already begun to understand. And as they stood there, the distance between their worlds still present but no longer defining, it became clear that the real challenge had not started in that meeting room. It had started now, in the quiet space where decisions were made not in front of others, but within themselves. And for Maya, the question was no longer whether she could step into his world. It was whether that world was ready for someone who refused to bend within it. The real cost of standing your ground is finding out who stands with you after. Maya felt that truth settle quietly as she stepped away from the building, the glass doors closing behind her with a soft finality that marked the end of the day, but not the end of what had started inside it. And the city greeted her the same way it always did, loud, indifferent, alive with movement that did not pause for anyone's personal turning point. And for a moment, she just stood there, Not rushing, not overwhelmed, just present in the aftermath of something she knew had mattered even if she did not yet know how. And Ethan walked beside her, hands in his coat pockets, his pace unhurried as if he understood that some moments needed space to settle. And after a few steps, he said, "You did not make it easier for them." And Maya let out a small breath, her gaze forward. "I was not trying to," she replied. And there was no apology in her tone, no second guessing, just clarity, and Ethan nodded. Slightly, not expecting anything different, because that had become the pattern. She did not adjust to make situations more comfortable. She stayed aligned with what she believed, regardless of the environment, and they walked in silence for a few more seconds before he added, "They're going to push back harder now." And Maya glanced at him briefly. "Then they should," she said, and that answer carried the same quiet confidence that had defined every choice she had made so far, not because she was looking for conflict, but because she was not afraid of it when it came. And Ethan studied her for a moment, recognizing something in that response that most people in his world had learned to avoid, the willingness to accept resistance without backing down. And as they reached the corner, he slowed slightly, turning to face her. "I need you to understand something," he said, his tone shifting just enough to signal that this was not part of the test anymore. This was real. This is not just about ideas. It is about power, about who gets to decide what matters. And Maya met his gaze, not intimidated, not dismissive, just listening. And she replied, "I already know that." And there was no hesitation in her voice, because she had lived it, not in boardrooms or strategy meetings, but in smaller, quieter ways that added up. Over time, in missed opportunities, in assumptions made before she spoke, in doors that closed without explanation. And Ethan nodded slowly, acknowledging that difference, because while he understood power from the inside, she understood it from the outside, and that contrast was exactly what made this moment significant. And he said, "Then you also know it does not change quickly." And Maya allowed a small pause before answering. "Neither do people," she said, and that was where their perspectives met, not in agreement, but in understanding, and the conversation shifted then, not away from the tension but deeper into it, because now it was no longer about whether she could handle the environment. It was about whether the environment could handle her presence within it. And as they stood there, the traffic light changing, people crossing around them, Maya reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the envelope from the community center and the card Ethan had given her. Two different paths, two different kinds of value. And she pulled out the envelope briefly, looking at it as if reminding herself of where she had been just hours before. And then she looked back at Ethan. "If I stay in this," she said, her voice steady, "it cannot be about proving something to them." And Ethan did not interrupt, did not redirect. He simply listened, because this was not a statement for him to shape. It was one for her to define. And she continued, "It has to mean something beyond this building." And there it was, the condition, not spoken as a demand, but as a boundary, the line that would determine whether this was worth continuing. And Ethan took a moment before responding, not because he disagreed, but because he understood the weight of what she was asking. And he said, "Then we make it mean something." And the simplicity of his answer did not diminish its significance, because it was not a promise of ease. It was a commitment to direction. And Maya studied him for a second longer, searching for the gap between intention and action, the place where words often failed. But she did not find it. Not yet. And she nodded once, slowly, accepting the possibility without fully trusting it. And the light changed again, the city continuing its rhythm as they stepped forward, moving with the crowd but not defined by it. And as they reached the other side, Ethan stopped briefly, turning toward her. "Tomorrow is not another test," he said, his voice calm but certain. "It is a decision." And Maya held his gaze, understanding exactly what that meant, because this was no longer about one day, one meeting, one moment of standing her ground. This was about whether she would step into something larger, something that would challenge her in ways she had not yet seen. And she said, "Then I will decide. Tomorrow." Not delaying, not avoiding, just giving herself the space to choose fully. And Ethan gave a small nod, respecting that, because for the first time, this was not about him offering an opportunity. It was about her choosing whether it deserved her. And as they parted ways, the distance between them no longer defined by class or circumstance, but by timing, by the space between what had happened and what would come next. Maya walked back toward the life she knew, the uncertainty still present but no longer overwhelming, because now it was balanced by something else, something that had not existed before. And across the city, as the lights continued to flicker on and the night settled in, the impact of a single decision, a $10 bill placed in the right moment, continued to unfold in ways neither of them could fully control, because sometimes the smallest act of kindness does not just change a day, it forces an entire system to confront what it has been choosing to overlook. The moment you are given a real choice is the moment everything you say you believe gets tested. Maya did not sleep much that night, not because she was afraid, but because her mind refused to settle, replaying every word, every look, every shift in tone from the day before, not as doubt, but as preparation, because she understood that what came next would not be about one conversation or one decision. It would be about consistency, about whether she could walk into that building again and still be the same person when the stakes were higher. And when the morning light filtered through the cracked window, she was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, the envelope and the card resting side by side in her hand. Two paths that now felt less like options and more like responsibilities, and she stood up slowly, getting ready with the same quiet focus she had carried the day before. No rush, no hesitation, just intention. And when she stepped outside, the air felt different. Not because the city had changed, but because she had, just enough to recognize that this was not about surviving another day. It was about deciding what kind of future she was willing to step into. And across the city, Ethan stood in the same place he often did before the day began, looking out over the skyline. But his focus was not on the buildings or the movement below. It was on what he had set in motion. Because for the first time in a long time, he was not certain how it would unfold. And that uncertainty did not frustrate him. It sharpened his attention, because it meant the outcome would not be controlled, it would be revealed. And when Maya walked into the building again, the atmosphere felt subtly different, not dramatically, but enough for her to notice. The way conversations paused a second longer, the way eyes followed her just slightly more openly, because now she was not just a visitor, she was a presence, something that had already disrupted the balance once and might do it again. And she did not slow down, did not adjust her pace. She moved with the same steady confidence as before, not to prove she belonged, but because she refused to act like she did not. And when she reached the upper floor, Ethan was already waiting, his posture relaxed but his attention focused, and he did not greet her with small talk or unnecessary explanation. He simply said, "Today, you decide if this is where you stay." And Maya nodded once, understanding immediately that this was not about performance, it was about alignment. And he gestured toward another room, smaller this time, quieter, and as they stepped inside, she saw something different from the day before. No executives, no audience, just a single table, a set of documents, and a screen displaying a live feed from several community programs across the city, including the one she had been in just yesterday. And Ethan spoke calmly. "These are the programs we discussed," he said, "the ones that are at risk." And Maya stepped closer, her eyes scanning the images, recognizing the faces, the environment, the quiet dignity of people who relied on those spaces, and something in her expression shifted, not with emotion alone, but with clarity, because now this was no longer theoretical, it was immediate, it was real. And Ethan continued, "I have the authority to approve the cuts," he said, his voice steady. "And I also have the authority to stop them." And Maya turned to look at him, understanding the weight of what he was saying, not as a test, but as a transfer of influence. Because this was not about her opinion anymore. It was about her impact. And he added, "If you stay, you will be part of that decision." And the room fell quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said was already there, in the space between them, in the images on the screen, in the path that had led to this moment. And Maya took a slow breath, her gaze returning to the screen, watching as someone handed a tray of food to another person, a small act, simple, necessary, the kind of act that had started all of this. And she thought about the bus, about the $10, about the cost, about the consequence, and she realized something that had not been clear before, that this was not about stepping into Ethan's world or staying in her own. It was about whether she was willing to carry her values into a space that would challenge them every single day. And she said, "If I stay, it does not mean I agree with everything here." And Ethan nodded immediately. "It should not," he replied. And she continued, her voice steady but firm. "And it does not mean I will be quiet when something is wrong." And again, he nodded, not just accepting it, but expecting it. And for a moment, they stood there in complete understanding, not of each other entirely, but of the terms that would define what came next. And Maya reached forward, not to take anything, not to sign anything, but simply to place her hand on the edge of the table, grounding herself in the decision she was about to make. And she said, "Then I stay." And the words did not come with hesitation, did not carry doubt. They were clear, deliberate, and final. And Ethan watched her for a second longer before responding, not with approval, not with praise, but with something more meaningful. "Then we begin," he said. And in that moment, the shift was complete, not from one world to another, but from observer to participant, from being tested to becoming part of the change itself. And as the screens continued to display the quiet reality of lives affected by decisions made in rooms like this, Maya stood there, no longer outside the system, but not consumed by it either, because she had made her choice not to belong to it, but to influence it. And across the city, the ripple of a single act of kindness continued to expand, no longer confined to a bus ride or a missed opportunity, but now shaping decisions that would reach far beyond anything she had imagined. Because sometimes the true impact of doing the right thing is not immediate. It is revealed only when you are given the power to do it again on a much larger scale. Power does not prove who you are. It exposes what you choose to protect. The words did not need to be spoken out loud for Maya to feel their weight as she stood in that room, her decision still echoing quietly in the space around her. And for a moment nothing moved. Not the screens, not the air, not even Ethan, because this was the shift, the exact point where intention turned into consequence. And then everything resumed, subtle at first, the screens updating, the system recognizing a new directive, the quiet hum of change beginning beneath the surface. And Ethan stepped closer to the console, his hand hovering briefly before confirming the override that would halt the cuts, not as an act of defiance, but as a recalibration, a decision that would ripple outward in ways that could not be easily reversed. And Maya watched it happen, not with excitement, not with relief, but with awareness, because she understood that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of resistance, of questions, of challenges that would follow immediately. And she said quietly, "They are not going to accept this easily." And Ethan did not look away from the screen as he replied, "They do not have to." And that answer carried a different kind of weight now, not authority for its own sake, but responsibility. Because this was no longer theoretical, this was action. And within minutes, the response began, notifications appearing, requests for clarification, meeting alerts stacking rapidly as the decision moved through the structure of the company. And the calm of the room shifted into something more active, more charged, and Maya could feel it even before the door opened again, this time without hesitation, without courtesy pauses, as two senior executives stepped in there. Expressions controlled but unmistakably tense, and one of them spoke immediately. "We need to discuss what just happened." And Ethan turned calmly, not defensive, not dismissive, just present. "We are discussing it now," he replied, and Maya remained where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply part of the moment without trying to dominate it. And the second executive's gaze shifted briefly toward her, sharper this time, less subtle than before. "This is exactly the concern," he said, "decisions influenced by someone who does not understand the full scope." And the words were measured, but the implication was clear, and Maya felt it, not as an attack, but as a familiar attempt to diminish her position without directly confronting her argument. And she did not respond immediately. She allowed the statement to exist, to reveal itself fully. And then she stepped forward just enough to be seen clearly, her voice calm, steady. "Then explain the scope," she said, and the room paused again, because that was not defiance, it was invitation, it was a demand for clarity rather than a rejection of authority, and the executive hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding, outlining projections, cost analyses, long-term efficiency models, all the language that had filled the previous meeting, and Maya listened, not interrupting, not dismissing, absorbing it fully, and when he finished, she nodded slightly. So the scope is numbers, she said, and the impact is people. And there it was again, the line that divided their perspectives, not because one was wrong and the other right, but because one was incomplete without the other, and the tension rose, not dramatically, but enough to shift the balance of the room, and Ethan stepped in then, not to end the conversation, but to anchor it. This is exactly why the decision stands, he said, his tone calm but final. Because the scope was missing something, and the words landed. With a quiet authority that did not require repetition, and the executives exchanged a brief look, not agreeing, not conceding, but recognizing that this moment was not one they could override immediately, and after a pause, one of them said, "Then we will revisit this with the board," and Ethan nodded once. Of course, and the conversation ended not with resolution, but with direction, and as the door closed behind them, the room returned to a quieter state. But the energy had changed. It was no longer contained. It was moving outward, into meetings, into discussions, into decisions that would test the foundation of what had just been set in motion. And Maya exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in recognition, because this was the reality she had stepped into, not a single choice, but a series of consequences that would follow it. And she turned to Ethan, her expression steady. "This is going to get bigger," she said, and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "It should," he replied. And there was no uncertainty in his voice, because this was no longer about whether the system would resist. It was about whether they would hold their position when it did. And Maya nodded slowly, understanding that this was not a moment she could walk away from easily now, not because she was trapped, but because she had chosen to stay. And as she looked back at the screens, at the programs that would continue, at the people who would not lose what little support they had, she realized something that had not been clear before, that the $10 she had given on that bus had not just been an act of kindness. It had been the first decision in a chain that had led her here, to this exact moment where she was doing the same thing again, choosing to stand for something that cost more than it gave. And as the city outside continued its endless motion, unaware of the quiet shift happening within a single room, Maya stood there not as someone who had been saved, but as someone who had stepped into the responsibility of making sure others did not fall through the same gaps she had seen. And for the first time, the distance between her world and Ethan's did not feel like a divide. It felt like a bridge being built, one decision at a time, held together not by power alone, but by the willingness to use it differently. The smallest decision can echo the longest. When someone finally chooses to see it, the room did not feel the same anymore, not because it had changed physically, but because something within it had shifted permanently. And as Maya stood there, watching the screen stabilize, watching the notifications slow into a controlled flow instead of a flood, she understood that this moment was no longer about proving anything. It was about what came after, and Ethan moved beside her, his posture no longer that of someone observing an experiment, but of someone who had committed to its outcome. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to debate, only something to carry forward. And outside the building, the city continued as it always had, unaware that a decision made in a quiet room had just altered the path of countless lives in ways that would never be traced back to this exact moment. And Maya turned slightly, her gaze moving from the screens to the window, where the skyline stretched out in layers of glass and light, and she said quietly, "It is strange." And Ethan glanced at her, waiting, and she continued, "How something so small can lead here." And he followed her gaze, understanding immediately what she meant. Not just the moment, but the beginning of it. The bus, the rain, the $10 that had seemed insignificant at the time. And he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out the bus ticket, still preserved, still carrying the weight of everything that had followed. And he held it out toward her, not as a gift, not as a symbol of debt, but as a reminder. And Maya looked at it for a second before taking it carefully, her fingers brushing against the edges as if grounding herself in the reality of what had happened, and she let out a small breath. "I thought that day cost me everything," she said, her voice soft but steady, and Ethan shook his head slightly. "It revealed everything," he replied, and the distinction mattered, because it reframed the loss not as an end, but as a beginning, and Maya nodded slowly, understanding settling into place, because she could see it now, the line that connected it all, not by chance, but by choice. And she looked back at him, her expression no longer guarded, but clear. "Then we do not stop here," she said, and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "We do not," he replied, and that was the moment the direction solidified, not as a plan written in documents or approved in meetings, but as a shared understanding that what they had started would continue beyond a single decision. And in the days that followed, the ripple expanded, meetings intensified, discussions grew sharper, resistance became more organized, but so did support, because what had been invisible before was now being acknowledged, questioned, defended, and Maya moved through it all with the same consistency she had shown from the beginning, not changing her approach, not softening her stance, simply remaining aligned with what had brought her there in the first place. And slowly, the shift became visible, not in dramatic announcements, but in smaller decisions, programs maintained, resources redirected, conversations reframed, and Ethan watched it unfold not as someone controlling the outcome, but as someone witnessing the impact of allowing a different perspective to exist within a system that had long resisted it. And one evening, as the city lights reflected off the glass walls of the building, Maya stood once again by the window, the bus ticket now framed in a simple glass case on the table beside her, not displayed as a trophy, but kept as a reminder of where it had all begun. And Ethan joined her quietly, his presence no longer distant, but familiar. And for a moment they both looked out at the city, the movement, the endless flow of people making decisions they did not realize would matter. And Maya said, "Do you think they will ever see it the same way?" And Ethan considered the question before answering. "Some will," he said. "Others will not." And Maya nodded slightly, accepting that, because change had never been about everyone agreeing. It had always been about enough people choosing differently. And she glanced down at the framed ticket, the small piece of paper that had carried more weight than anything else she had ever held, and she said, "Then it was worth it." And Ethan allowed a small, genuine smile, not because the outcome had been easy, but because it had been real. And as the night settled over the city, the story that had begun with a single act of kindness did not end. It continued, not in headlines or recognition, but in the quiet, consistent choices made every day afterward, because the truth was never about who gave the $10 or who held the power. It was about what happened when those two things met, and whether they chose to walk away or build something that made the next choice easier for someone else. And in that, the answer had already been decided.